Plenty of seats up front, right over here, if you're looking for a place to sit. Looks like 8 or 9 seats. We won't even charge you for sitting in them. Sorry, ma'am, it took us so long to get you a fork. All right. Well, welcome everyone to American Prairie's National Discovery Center and the Clyde Aspavig Event Center. I'm David Cunningham, the Karen and Jay Abbey Director of the National Discovery Center. So tonight marks our very first Speaker Series program. The Speaker Series is designed to showcase presenters from the worlds of conservation, ecology, the humanities, and other areas that align with the mission of American Prairie. The presenters we schedule for this series have made or are making very significant contributions to their fields. So because this is our inaugural event, we wanted to start with someone very special who has impacted and continues to impact us in many ways through his meaningful work, Jason Valdez. So Mr. Valdez is the executive director. You may applaud. Mr. Valdez is the executive director of the Wind River Tribal Buffalo Initiative, a member of the Eastern Shoshone tribe who lives on the Wind River Reservation. Mr. Valdez works to restore bison back to the homelands of indigenous nations like his own as a way to reconnect and restore cultural belief systems, as well as heal from the atrocities of the past and present. In addition, Jason is the Tribal Buffalo Senior Program Manager for the Tribal Partnerships Program at the National Wildlife Federation. He sits on the Board of Directors for the Intertribal Buffalo Council, Board of Trustees for the Conservation Lands Foundation, and the Environmental Commission of the Congress of Nations and States. He is also adjunct professor at Central Wyoming College and Wind River Tribal College. Jason received his undergraduate and graduate degrees in land resources and environmental sciences from Montana State University, where he focused on tribal bison restoration. Jason's presentation tonight will be followed by a moderated panel discussion, which will include Mr. Valdez, Jason Belcour from Rocky Boy, who is the Chippewa Cree Tribe's Sustainability Coordinator, Shakayla Wykow of Fort Belknap, who is interning with the Buffalo Research and Education Center, and Scott Heidebrink, American Prairie's Director of Bison Restoration. So cheers for Scott. No. Anyway, the panel discussion will be moderated by Corey Williamson. She's American Prairie Senior Outreach Manager. So as a reminder, please refrain, if you can, from leaving your seats during the presentation and panel discussion. There will be a 10-minute break prior to the panel discussion when you can visit the refreshment table again. And then please plan to stay for the meet and greet afterwards. And finally, please silence your phones. So without further ado, let's give a big hand to Jason Valdez.
We've got to add Go Cats in there. Go Cats. I spent 10 years in Bozeman, and it was nice to kind of drive through there not too long ago, but it's changed a little bit since we left. Bozeman was good. I want to thank the Discovery Center for the invitation to come and visit with you today and this evening. My wife and I came up from Wind River last night, and fortunately we must have brought this with us. We haven't been able to get rid of winter down there in Wyoming either. It's been a lot of snow and very wintry for us there. So very glad to be here with you this evening and talk a little bit about the work I'm involved in at Wind River and nationally on issues for buffalo restoration and ensuring that we can get them back into our lives in a good way, in a meaningful way. I'm a member of the Eastern Shoshone tribe. I manage our 80-plus buffalo there at Wind River and work closely with the Northern Arapaho. you know, they put enemy tribes in hopes that we'd kill each other off, but we've married each other. My wife, Patty, she's a member of the Arapaho tribe, and she's here with me tonight. So we're getting along down there in Wind River, and the buffalo is something we don't have to argue about. So very glad to be here. There was a mention of Intertribal Buffalo Council, and I'd like to show this graphic up here, so kind of shows a very holistic way that we're trying to work with tribes and ensuring that we get buffalo back to all of our members. Intertribal Buffalo Council has 80 tribes now, and we work to restore 20,000 plus animals to 65 herds in 20 states in the last 30 years. And want to, of course, recognize Robbie Magnan and Johnny Bearcub Stiffarm, who are here in the audience with us from Fort Peck, who've also been significant leaders in tribal buffalo restoration and the work that they've done there at Fort Peck. They're also member tribes of the Intertribal Buffalo Council. And so this wheel here is a little bit about the work that we're doing with ITBC, where we've been lobbying in DC for a number of years for legislation that would hold federal government trust responsibility in place. The Indian Buffalo Management Act, we nearly got it through last session, but that would really codify or in statute the federal trust responsibility that the federal government has to tribes in terms of treaty rights and access to traditional foods, and ensuring that we have a good feasible way to feed our people again. And many folks in the room here are involved in efforts in their own communities restoring buffalo to their school lunch programs, to their elders, to various programs within our tribes to ensure that we are helping to heal our people. Nearly this wheel is about healing. This is a medicine wheel. That philosophy is amongst our Indian people, our tribes across the country, as well as other indigenous people throughout the planet. Just give an idea about this length of time that people have been here. You know, a lot of our stories, a lot of our people talk about being here for tens of thousands of years. Of course, we're taught about the Bering Strait land bridge theory and things, but a lot of those things are being debunked in a way, you know, such as these fossilized footprints in white sands down in New Mexico that are 24,000-year-old footprints. And so we're constantly reminded about some of these archaeological digs and finds that really help us question some of the history that we've been taught. So the backyard at home in the Wind Rivers on the reservation is a very important place for us, as are many across this country. These lands are now places where we go and hunt and harvest and fish and camp and take our kids and our children to ensure that they have a connection to these places as well. This particular canyon, you know, we've been, again, by archaeological evidence, you know, 15,000 years of occupation here. There's caves where we used to bury our chiefs that the cavalry dynamited shut and things, but a lot of connection to this homeland. And it was even a site for a 1920s movie prior to becoming a reservoir that gives our community water. And so the place is very special, as many are for us. The Shoshone people, the eastern band of Shoshone, was known as the Gwich'in, the Buffalo Eaters. We distinguished ourselves by the foods we ate. The Tukadikas, they were the sheep eaters who lived in the mountains and subsisted on that bighorn sheep, made the sheep horn bow that many tribes utilized and were, you know, was a highly sought after trade item to trade with other tribes, and it was very important. Of course, those buffalo hide teepees in the background. You know, it takes 17 buffalo to create a teepee, and so if you have a community of 20 teepees, that's over 300 buffalo just in those lodges. And there isn't really a good term for the way that our people lived with the land. And like many tribes, we were defined as nomadic. But if you look up nomadic in the dictionary, it actually says wandering aimlessly. It's not a very good description for the relationship that we had with our land, our foods and medicines, because we had a cyclical relationship with the land. It was based on the cosmos. It was based on the cycles of the planets. The spring equinox and the solstice were defining times in change. You know, we live in an area here that has 4 seasons. We're getting ready for that main season of life and rebirth and regrowth, spring. And so spring would have dictated a change in our foods, and we would have moved to different elevations. We would have gathered different plants and medicines, and we would also went after different proteins. And for us, sometimes it was fish, sometimes it was buffalo, sometimes the sage chicken, pronghorn antelope. We would go up high, trade with our relatives, the Tucarikas, the bighorn sheep eaters. And so that cyclical relationship was understood by the early commissioners of the federal government that recognized we had large territories, and many tribes, of course, had large territories, and often that was delineated by our first treaties. This medicine wheel belief system is kind of similar across tribes. The Lakotas use it and have it and integrate it into their life ways. It's symbolic of our ceremonies, the sun dance, the sweat lodges, even the teepee, sits in a circle. Those lodges, those doors, they face the east in order to greet the sun. It's all written in stone in this. And so there's a lot of beliefs and philosophies that are wrapped into this medicine wheel. At certain times of the year, there's my Netflix thing coming up. Oh, oops, shouldn't have done that. There we go. Thought we were going to watch a Netflix show there for a second. So this medicine wheel, as you can see, it's cycles of the moon, change at each time of the year. We're going into spring, which would have dictated certain plants, certain fish, certain 4-legged species that we would go after, and so on. So this medicine wheel is kind of integrated into lots of things, like even our human beings, we go through stages in life. We all go through becoming a baby. We go to youth, adult, and elder. We think about balance spiritually, mentally, physically, emotionally. It has ties to lots of our growth as human beings, but also our connection to the plant and animal world and water. So it's just a very important concept to think about things in a circle, that cyclical understanding. It was also written in our stories on Buffalo Hides, this connection. The Sundance is a ritual, annual sacrifice to recognize that power of the sun. In science, we call that photosynthesis. But for Native people, we understood that sun was the bringer of life, and that ceremonies dictated our relationship. And so we couldn't have the Sundance without the buffalo. And for over 100 years, we continue to maintain those belief systems, even though they were illegal up until 1978 with the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. So the ceremonies and things that we were able to hold on to despite them being outlawed by the federal government is part of that history and why we're trying to restore this connection with buffalo. And so many tribes, again, have this connection to buffalo in a similar way that Shoshone people do. The food source, that buffalo meat is the highest in protein, minerals, and vitamins, and lowest in fat and cholesterol than almost any other meat. Today, our Native American communities have high prevalence of diabetes and heart disease and other health-related issues. And so getting buffalo back into our diet is a way to help us heal from the inside out. Maintenance of our ancestral foods, where we would go and gather berries and things in the summer. There's a lot of programs in Indian country now working to reintegrate our connection to our ancestral foods. Of course, buffalo is foundational to that. This animal was the primary animal in life's commissary, that it provided our food, our clothing, shelter. It was our tools, and I have a few tools up here with me that we'll talk a little bit about. This relationship to buffalo is also written in stone in terms of our pictographs and petroglyphs. We have all along the Rocky Mountain front from Canada all the way clear down into Central America. So the Tribal Partnerships Program of the National Wildlife Federation, National Wildlife Federation has supported the Wind River tribes for quite some time. My father is a retired biologist, and he worked for a number of years to restore fisheries. As a little kid, I got to witness the reintroduction of pronghorn antelope and bighorn sheep. But NWF has supported a lot of our work, as are several other nonprofit conservation organizations working with tribes to try to integrate, again, this idea of merging Western science and indigenous science. Indigenous science is very old and has been here a very long time and is a different worldview and paradigm. But our Western science brings many tools and many understandings that integrate very well. And so how do we find that bridge? And I'm supported by National Wildlife Federation in a lot of this work. I mentioned a little bit about the Intertribal Buffalo Council having a membership of 80 tribes. That number continues to grow each and every year. Our furthest tribe to the east is now the Seneca in New York. And last year alone, we moved 2,200 buffalo across our member tribes to get those animals restored. And so we have MOUs with the National Park Service, with organizations like the Nature Conservancy, and many others to continue to support our work in Intertribal Buffalo Council. This is the logo for the Conservation Lands Foundation, and CLF is an organization really helping to support the grassroots effort of tribes, supporting sacred areas, protection of certain places. You maybe heard of Bears Ears or Grand Staircase, Escalante, or Oak Flat. These are areas that are very important to tribes where CLF is working to protect and expand our existing conservation lands across the country. I'm a member of the Shoshone tribe and oversee our buffalo program there. And as you can see, many of these logos, again, have that circle, but obviously also that buffalo. And for the Shoshone people, this animal was missing from our community for about 130 years. Reverend Roberts was an Episcopal missionary who spent 66 years with the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho, and he documented the number of animals being taken by the tribes at Wind River. In 1881, there was about 2,000 buffalo taken. By 1885, there were 10, and then there were no more animals left after that. There were a few private herds and things that were established, but according to the tribes, they didn't get returned until 2016 when we brought the first 10. Prior to European arrival, our health and wealth was based in the biodiversity of plants and animals. And I mentioned that medicine wheel and how that applied to the different foods. So all of the critters that we live here with had an important reciprocal relationship with. We talk about the four-leggeds, the winged ones, the ones that swim, the ones that crawl above and below the ground. In our language, we say Damat Neruwara. In Arapaho, we say Besihi Neteina. And that means all our relatives. And so when we're talking about these animals and things that we live here with, we see those as our relatives, and that we're caretakers and we're stewards for the four-legged, the winged ones, the ones that crawl above and below the ground, the ones that swim and fly. So Damat Neruwara refers to all of our relatives. This is a picture of my dad, and I was very fortunate to grow up with this guy, and he still gives me a hard time making sure I'm doing what he told me I should be doing. I go to him for a lot of advice, but he's a retired biologist. He worked for years for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I got to hear him talk a lot about the importance of biodiversity, and I think he was bringing indigenous science to his management before it was a kind of a cool thing to do. He was reprimanded by the Secretary of Interior for advocating for tribes and tribal sovereignty at the time. And what he worked to do was implement protections for our wildlife species, encouraging the tribes to exercise their sovereignty and self-determination through our own tribal laws to protect species. So I was very fortunate to go with my dad when he drug me out of school one day and said, we're going to go catch some antelope. And he worked closely with like the Wyoming Game and Fish Department and other entities in the state. So they had organized these trappings of pronghorn antelope where you put these big nets up and they wander in there and you drop the net and you go tackle them or as carefully as you can, cover their eyes and put them in a trailer. And his idea of wildlife restoration is you get these, you go to these places in their habitat, you get them and you bring them to their new habitat, and then they grow and they exist. And he told me that these antelope, they're going to do well. And he said within 10 years you're going to harvest your first antelope. Well, I harvested my first antelope 8 years later, and I've harvested one every year since. So this antelope being restored was something that I witnessed from a very young age, and the importance of that to ensure that we had, a food source for our people that was based in our historical connections. Bighorn sheep was also extirpated from the reservation. These species were overhunted prior to 1984, and then when they were reintroduced to their habitat, they did very well. Towards the tail end of his career, he worked to understand how much buffalo habitat we would have, and it was determined that our reservation has actually more habitat than what's even available in Yellowstone. So why is there a discrepancy on our lands? Why were these animals, overhunted? Fortunately, in 1984, we implemented a game code, and that game code allowed for the reintroduction of these species, and now they flourish. My grandma and grandpa on my mom's side, I think a lot about them. They were the ones who went through our boarding school. And so these were the last speakers in my family of our Shoshone language. They didn't teach their children because they didn't want to go through what they did as kids in the boarding school. And so I often think about my grandma and grandpa. Both are gone now, but I still remember them as a kid, trying to talk to them, learn about Shoshone, but their hesitancy, the pain that they carried from their childhood is difficult. And a lot of our tribal members in our communities have a similar story about their grandmas and grandpas going through the boarding school era and what that did in terms of intergenerational trauma. So my hope is that decisions that I make are honorable to my grandma and grandpa and my descendants. The leadership of our Shoshone people who were the decision makers in the 1860s, the 1870s, 1880s for fighting for what it is that we needed to maintain for our Shoshone people. And then when our neighbors, the Arapaho, came, that what they were fighting to protect is still what we're trying to uphold. The values and belief systems of Washakie, of our Nez Perce people, the Lakota people, the Blackfeet, the Northern Cheyenne. We all have similar stories of trying to hold on to these belief systems and values that were passed to us. The warrior culture. For us, our warrior peoples are providers, they're protectors, they're spiritual people. So we're trying to instill that into our young people to ensure that they can be proud of who they are as Shoshone or Arapaho people, but also holding on to our belief ways as providers and protectors. We had the opportunity to look at the United States with the tribes prior to colonization. This is how the territories overlap. And there's over 574 federally recognized tribes in this country, all with a very unique story similar to the one I'm sharing with you. They have their languages. There's over 300 distinct languages on this continent of indigenous people, all with unique relationship and understanding to their foods, their water, their resources. I think it's very interesting to note that this continent for thousands of years was lived on by these people, but you could still go and drink from the rivers and the streams without getting sick. When colonial Europeans arrived, there was no common cold, there was no flu, there was no cancer, there was no Giardia or E. coli. There were not a lot of the sicknesses that we have today. And today I think that we can learn from our indigenous brothers and sisters and relatives about our connection to our foods and water to ensure that we leave it better than the way we found it. Shoshone people come from the south. We speak the Numic branch of the Uto-Aztecan dialect. So you can see up there in the northern part of that map, the Shoshone. But our language comes from the south. So again, that land bridge theory doesn't fit. And there's interesting connection to stories that we hear about foods like the sweet potato and the chicken that's tied to Polynesian people that may have arrived in Central America, but that's another conversation. The vast trade networks that existed here, the area for the Shoshone Rendezvous, which is right around Salt Lake and in the south, what is now southwest Wyoming, was a hub for tribes to trade. And of course, prior to the horse, we got around on foot, but we were, that said that a lot of these medicine wheels that we have in the Rocky Mountain front contain stones from different parts of Turtle Island. Turtle Island is the North American continent. So this trade network existed, and of course, California was the most diverse place from the Arctic all the way to South America in terms of the diversity of people. And we don't often think about California as being a Native American heavy state, but the history there, not always the brightest history, but again, the trade networks was a pretty cool thing to look at, and how the tribes interacted, intermarried, traded, came together at certain times of the year for celebration. Interesting to think about. As westward expansion continued to happen, there were treaties made, and the very first treaty with the Eastern Shoshone tribe, and of course every tribe's going to have a similar story. But the Fort Bridger Treaty was the first treaty made with the Eastern Shoshone Band in 1863. Not long after, and because of gold, because of westward expansion, the Oregon, California, Mormon, Pony Express, all of these trails came through our territory. And of course that created conflict. You see the Bozeman Trail, the Bridger Trail, all of these expeditions, kind of reaching out, crossing our territories, of course created more and more conflict over time. As the federal government encouraged westward expansion, it was really to help eliminate the Indian problem, as they called it. The federal government referred to tribes as being in the way of westward expansion. As reservations were established, then they took it a step further by opening up reservations for homesteading, and I'll show a few instances of that. So this is that 1863 Fort Bridger Treaty superimposed on a modern day map showing the boundaries of Wyoming and Idaho and Colorado and Utah. So that was a 44 million acre reservation in 1863. But only 5 years later, it was reduced to by 41 million acres. And again, that's because of those trails and things and the conflicts that were happening. But again, promises were broken. We zoom in a little bit more, and then the area to the south of the reservation called the Bruneau Cession was enacted. And of course, this was a time when there was quite a bit of sickness. There was cholera, diphtheria, tuberculosis, smallpox. A lot of our people died from disease at that time. So these negotiations were being made not in a good way. That area from south of the reservation now, there's been millions of dollars pulled out in mining in terms of steel and gold out of that area. The area around Thermopolis, maybe some of you have gone to swim at Thermopolis, which is a hot springs. McLaughlin was an Indian commissioner who made this agreement. It was supposed to be 1 mile by 1 mile, but he scribbled in a couple zeros and made it 10 miles by 10 miles. Then in 1906, all lands north of the Big Wind River were ceded. This was when the reservations were opened up for homesteading, and they were encouraging farmers and ranchers to come in and buy up these cheap Indian lands. And so our reservations were opened up for homesteading. So this was the map of the Shoshone Reservation in 1906. And everything north was divided up and checkerboarded and divvied out into 160-acre plots. Fortunately, some lands were returned in 1938, except for the Riverton Reclamation Project. And even today, this is primarily non-Indian community. The Bureau of Reclamation came in 1930s and built a dam to divert the Wind River to the irrigators in this area. And so there's a very contentious fight over water on the reservation. Who controls water on the reservation? And actually, the state of Wyoming filed suit in 1977 against the tribes. The tribes said, well, you know, we're going to fight to protect the water. And so we developed in our own laws a water code. And it had 15 beneficial uses of water in there: agricultural, municipal, cultural, groundwater, riparian, in-stream flow. It was a 30-year-long court case, and finally in 1992, the Wyoming Supreme Court came out and said that the reservation was established for ag use, and that in-stream flow to benefit of fisheries not considered a beneficial use of water in the state of Wyoming. The number one use of water in the state of Wyoming is for ag. So we were told as tribes that we can't use our water unless it's for ag. In-stream flow to protect a fishery, not considered beneficial. So today there's over a 55-mile stretch of river that dries up because 100% of the river is taken for agriculture. And we're in a high elevation desert. And you know, a lot of the crops that they're growing is alfalfa and sugar beet, high water use crops in a high elevation desert. That's still a very contentious issue, and we could talk the entire night about water. But the fact of the matter is that we have still somewhat of a large land base that we're trying to hold on to. What little we have left. Ironically, in 1938, those lands were returned. At the same time, the tribes recognized, you know, we should probably do something to protect what we have left. And so in the 1930s, our tribal leadership designated a wilderness area. We have 265 lakes on our reservation. More than 200 of them are in that wilderness area in the Wind Rivers. It has several hundred miles of rivers and streams. It butts up against other federal lands like the Shoshone National Forest and Bridger Teton National Forest. So as we lost land, we were protecting land in the 30s. And actually, this happened 26 years before the Federal Wilderness Act, and a lot of the language that's in the Wilderness Act comes from the designation of this Wind River Wilderness area. The CSKT tribes would argue with me that they had the first wilderness, but Wind River did. So what we lost as opposed to what we protected, and this is wilderness is now a very important place. We've partnered with organizations at University of Wyoming, the Wyoming Migration Initiative. We've radio telemetry data from deer and elk, but also wolves and bears to show how important this area is in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. for those species. Mentioned we're part of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. If we think back about that 1863 map, many of these now, that original territory, now many of those lands are national park, wilderness, and national forest. So there's a lot of talk today about co-management and cooperative agreements and off-reservation hunting. These all kind of have plays into what we have to say about some of these lands, and we can talk a little bit more about the potential for things like that. Wyoming Migration Initiative also created these pretty cool maps of our place names. And so there's a pretty nice book of the Wyoming Migration Initiative that has those maps of where those animals are moving to, the importance of the habitat, but also our place names in Shoshone and Arapaho languages, and also Crow and Cheyenne and Lakota in places, because think of that original map, and many of these areas were overlapped traditional territory of many of these tribes. This is the map of the Wind River Reservation place names. So it's an effort to recognize, I think, the relationship that the Shoshone and Arapaho people and other tribes had to these areas, and it helps to educate the rest of Americans about our connection. Many of our languages have descriptors in there that describe history or events or why that place is an important area, and I think that we all benefit from that. Here's just a diagram showing the traditional, sometimes you hear it called traditional ecological knowledge, indigenous science, how we bring the knowledge of our grandmas and grandpas to the forefront to combine that with Western science. So I'm a scientist. I went to Montana State, focused in environmental science, where I learned a whole lot about nutrient cycling, ethnobotany, the importance of ecology and biology, statistics and calculus and chemistry. All of those concepts very important for understanding their interconnectedness and interrelatedness. That's emphasized in what comes in indigenous knowledge. So this is the regulations. So I mentioned in 1984 we passed a game code. This was highly contentious at the time because prior to this, our people could hunt year-round. We could go and harvest anything, anytime we wanted. And that's why we had no more pronghorn antelope and no more bighorn sheep in the 80s. The populations of elk and deer were diminishing rapidly. Year-round hunting may have been okay if our reservation remained at 44 million acres, but when it was reduced, then obviously hunting and fishing are going to have an influence on your populations. And so this was part of the work of my father as a biologist, was explaining or demonstrating to the tribes that if we were to implement our own law, then what would result would be the increase in these populations so that we would have better hunting opportunities, better access for sustenance to be able to feed our families. So what was predicted would happen did, and that was that we protect the habitat, we restore the species, they're going to build, and we're going to have animals in abundance. This is old data, 2013, but the numbers are even higher now. In the 90s, the biologists that were working for the Fish and Wildlife Service went to the elders of both tribes for 3 years, asking, what do wolves and bears mean to the Shoshone and Arapaho people? So our elders, they said, well, the wolves, they're very important because we learned about how to be good family members. They take care of their own. The way that they take care of one another is the way that we should be. So, like the buffalo, who are matriarchal, the people learned how to take care of one another. Our tribes were matriarchal at one time too, led by the eldest females, like that buffalo. The wolves demonstrated how we could be and take care of one another. The bears, we still we learned how to, we learned about medicines that we still use in our ceremonies. So the elders said, wolves and bears belong. They have a place. They've always been here. Dama Neruwura, Besihi Neteina, they're our relatives. So that was written into these plans to protect the species and ensure that there is balance. So that's again the blending of indigenous science and Western science. When I was a lot skinnier back then, I had the opportunity to go to East Africa and travel around. My dad, as a biologist, had been several times to Africa. He loved to go and photograph the wildlife. And I was 18, not really knowing what I was going to do with my life. And he suggested we go to Africa together. So we went for a month and traveled around, and then he left me there. I stayed around there for 6 months traveling on my own. It was an incredible experience to be able to see the landscape, to be able to see the animals and the people. What was most incredible to me was actually seeing the wildebeest. Maybe you've seen on TV the wildebeest migration through the Serengeti or the Masai Mara, crossing the Mara River, getting eaten by crocodiles. What I witnessed there was driving hundreds of miles, and as far as you could see in every direction is this. And you see hyenas and leopards and lions and cheetahs and zebras, impalas, gazelles, hippos, rhinos, a whole host of species, as far as you can see in every direction. We drove up from Wyoming last night. It would be like driving several hundred miles, and it looks like this. I can't describe what that looks like. But what was unfathomable to me was that this is less than 5% of what the buffalo was here less than 200 years ago. So that experience in seeing this wildebeest migration helped remind me of what was here on this continent. So when I came back, I had a newfound appreciation for understanding my history, understanding American history, understanding the treaties. There were over 800 treaties made with the tribes here, 400 of them ratified by Congress, but every single treaty broken or violated in some form or fashion. And if you look up treaty in the dictionary, it says supreme law of the land. So how can that be? So I had to question why things are the way they are and learn a little bit about what happened to the buffalo. Ken Burns has a documentary coming out. It's a 4-hour, 2-part series. It's coming out in June. It'll be aired nationally in October. But it tells the very in-depth history of this ugly past of what happened to buffalo. The hides and the tongues, the hides fueling the Industrial Revolution, the bones that littered the prairie, looked like snow in the middle of summer, the annihilation of the largest migratory herd in world history. There were 60 million buffalo here when Lewis and Clark came west in 1804. By 1902, there were less than 1,000 left. So not only did we destroy the largest migratory herd in world history, but we also erased all evidence of it. There was more money made off of the bones than there was on the hides. So I had to understand that history and look at why things are the way they are. So after buffalo were removed from the landscape and then tribes were forced onto reservations, they tried to make a better cow by crossbreeding, creating cattle. That didn't work so well, so later they created beefalo. So what this did to the bison genome was cause cattle gene introgression. So cattle gene introgression is in a majority of buffalo that we have in the United States today. 350,000 buffalo are in the commercial meat market, as indicated by that largest pie there. There's less than 25,000 conservation animals, is indicated in yellow and red. That large pie is also the majority that are in private herds, private producers. The little sliver of red is yellow. Red is tribal conservation herds. Our two herds at Wyoming are conservation animals because they come from populations with lineage to Yellowstone with very little or no cattle gene introgression. That sliver of yellow is 22 herds managed by the Department of Interior, scattered across the U.S. So our conservation animals are still a very small piece of the pie. The majority of buffalo have cattle gene introgression, are also managed for commercial meat production. And so that sliver of yellow and red is why it's so important. There's only a few herds of those that the Department of Interior manage that are at a threshold of 1,000 animals or more. Buffalo bison is red listed by the International Union of Conservation of Nature, right alongside the gorilla, the tiger, rhino, because they are ecologically extinct. They don't exist in large numbers on large landscapes anywhere anymore. So they're red listed because in order to maintain the genetic diversity, the genetic heterogeneity, we need to have at least satellite populations of at least 1,000 animals or more. And so there's many places where buffalo could be restored. There's land, there's public land, there's tribal land where these conservation animals could be restored. But we have, that's difficult. It's a challenge because it brings a new paradigm. And we are, as human beings, somewhat reluctant for change. The story of buffalo and native people is very similar in that we're now on remnants of our once former vast territories. The buffalo, of course, are now in parks and refuges and private ranches, and tribes on reservations. So the story goes hand in hand. What happened to buffalo and what happened to the people who depended on that buffalo. When our reservations were opened up for homesteading, it created this checkerboard effect between tribal and allotted and fee lands. This makes it very difficult to piece together habitat, to piece together corridors for wildlife movement and migration, because now each of these individual parcels costs thousands and thousands of dollars per acre. So how do we piece these things back? Some tribes' reservations are very checkerboarded. Some other tribes have a little bit more advantage in that some are more tribal land. In terms of Yellowstone, there's a lot of tribes that lay claim to this area. Last year, there was a big celebration in Yellowstone, and a lot of tribes came together to tell our stories about our connection to that area. Yellowstone doesn't like to admit that there's 49 tribes because that makes it very difficult for our managers like Cam Shawley to ensure that every tribe has an adequate connection to Yellowstone. So very difficult politically as a challenge to ensure that these tribes their voices are heard here. But a lot of tribes have interest in Yellowstone, and we can talk about that as well. Very important when we look about this history to understand the eras of federal Indian law and policy. There were 6 eras: coexistence, think back to the 13 colonies; removal and reservations, that was Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears that brought all the eastern tribes to Oklahoma. I was in Oklahoma the other day and learned that about the 39 tribes that are there. So most of our member tribes of Intertribal Buffalo Council are in Oklahoma. We have 12 member tribes down there. Allotment and assimilation, that was when the reservations were opened up for homesteading, opened up reservations to non-Indian farming and ranching. Then there was reorganization, which was short-lived, and then came outright termination and relocation. Over 140 million acres of land were lost during this era. Tribes were coaxed into moving to the cities with a promise of housing and jobs. That didn't work. It's also during the lead up to the civil rights era, which kind of established self-determination And self-determination is kind of the era that we're still in working to create a new future for our people and for our communities. Self-determination is really an idea that we have the self-government to really create our own policies and programs, education, and that is an exercise. Because of those treaty rights, that self-determination of those tribes is really guided by this idea. And that there's a trust responsibility because the federal government made those promises, even though they were broken, even though we can point to numerous occasions where those were broken, it still exists and is still being upheld at the Supreme Court. Sovereignty is really just the right to govern ourselves, and there's really no other group of people in the United States that have sovereignty. There's really no other Native Americans, because of those treaties, those promises and agreements, really carry that. So we're working to the best of our ability to exercise sovereignty and ensure that we can take it a step further in terms of how we feed ourselves. Buffalo was the food, and it was systematically removed. And so that federal government has a responsibility to ensure that we can get that animal restored to our communities. But I like this image of the buffalo, seeing it run. There was a period of time when this film was actually made when there wasn't, they didn't really think buffalo were even going to survive extinction. And so this is a pretty cool graphic. Remember, there's 330 languages in this country. Most people think about Tatanka, that's the Lakota word for the animal, but people say bison or buffalo all the time. First question, why do you say buffalo? Well, bison is the scientific name for the animal, obviously, but if you think back, way back to 1616, there was a Frenchman by the name of Samuel de Champlain who came, and he was with the Nipissing First Nation up in northern Great Lakes, and saw this animal that he recognized from his travels in Asia and Africa. And so he called it buffalo. And that term was used for over 100 years. It wasn't until 1738 that the 1730s that the scientists named the animal bison. So buffalo was already a prevalent term for 100 years in the native communities. And because French were often allied with tribes, that term stuck. Well, now a lot of our tribal names in our tribal communities have buffalo in them. So we're not going to go change our names to appease the scientists who tell us that bison is now the correct term. The correct term is the term in our language. In Shoshone, it's Bonjra. In Arapaho, it's Hithenon or Hanacha. Tatanka for the Lakota. But buffalo is obviously going to be a more common term in native communities. So if you hear bison or buffalo, you can give them that explanation. And of course, every year we see people trying to pet buffalo in Yellowstone, and that obviously doesn't turn out very well. I like to show this graphic to the kids because these aren't pets, and we're not trying to restore them as pets. We're restoring them for their very important cultural, traditional, spiritual use, to ensure that our young people know how to use this animal for sustenance again, to make tools, to learn about the historical importance and also the contemporary importance of how we reintegrate our knowledge of buffalo back into our communities. Last year at Wind River, we had 800 tribal youth come out to the buffalo, and something special happens when those kids make a connection. Whether they pick up a little piece of buffalo hair, or they make eye contact with a buffalo, or they help with the processing or butchering of one. There's a special reconnection that happens, and it's hard to describe. But now we can make our own new toys, because archaeologists and people talk a lot about the historic importance of buffalo. So these are very old toys that are sitting in a museum somewhere that little kids used to play with. And so we can make our own new toys now. I mentioned the importance nutritionally. This is the most healthy meat. And so that's very important for our native communities, but it's also important for our non-native communities. It's also very important that those people are producing buffalo meat that is available to the public. It obviously is more expensive than beef, but there is a desire for many people to get that healthier meat back into our diet. We'd also like to work to get that into our school lunch program. So as part of Intertribal Buffalo Council, we're back in DC working with USDA about how we can improve the process, the tribal meat inspection, or getting the FDIPR or SNAP programs to accept bison meat so we can get it back into our school lunch programs. We have evidence that suggests that buffalo meat back into our diet, especially of our young native kids, will improve cognitive ability and test scores because it's in our DNA. So as we reintegrate that buffalo back into our diet, because it's the healthiest, because there's a cultural connection that we can help heal from the inside out and ensuring that our kids are growing and eating the best foods available. Go Cats! It took me a long time to find a school, and so I really am proud of being a Bobcat because I didn't want to go to University of Wyoming. University of Wyoming is an ag school, and the logo is also a cowboy. And being a tribal person, as a native person, I didn't want to subscribe to that. So I went to Black Hills State University. I didn't find a community there, so I went to Colorado State University, didn't find a community there. But Montana State had a great community because of the 7 tribes, 7 reservations in Montana, and because I was able to work on a project that was meaningful to me. My grandma said, don't go to get an education, they're going to make you do what they want you to. She said, be grounded in who you are so that you go and get the tools to come home and help your people. So I was fortunate to be able to go to Montana State and bring this idea of integrating my education with tribal buffalo restoration. So I found some advisors that supported me in that and was able to find some dollars through the EPA Star Fellowship and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation that supported my research in the importance of buffalo ecologically, but also in terms of healing community. And so I spent 10 years in Bozeman and graduated with my master's in 2016, the very first year that we brought our first 10 buffalo back. But a lot of us don't realize that there's 4 extinct species here also. 300 and 400,000 years ago, there was bison latifrons here walking around that had a 9-foot horn span and was 10 feet at the shoulder. He lived alongside the short-faced bear and the giant sloth and the woolly mammoth, the woolly rhino. I don't know who that guy is down there, but the buffalo's cool. So latifrons, Antiquus, Priscus, and Occidentalis are all gone, but we still find their bones, and we still see them actually in Choban over in Idaho. Not too long ago, they found a latifron skull. So we still have a lot of the evidence of these species. This buffalo has been here for a very long time. People say, well, you think buffalo is going to belong okay here or there? And I think back about that map where they existed from the West Coast nearly all the way to the East Coast. They were in Florida, all the way from Mexico to the Arctic, from sea level to 13,000 feet in elevation. So this animal, this species, is probably the most well adapted for almost any ecological niche that we can put it in. But we have, obviously plowed up, paved over, fenced in, or fenced out most of the areas so that we don't do that. Again, the archaeological evidence is there. Even Europe has 4 extinct species that were there. Also a similar species to latifrons. Their busy physiological and behavioral adaptations, such as their dust bathing, wallowing behavior, is one of the most important things to in their influence on the landscape. These wallows create microdepressions in a landscape that's very important for water accumulation. As it rains and as it snows, the water sits in these pools, and that's increases groundwater recharge and soil water holding capabilities. There's seed dispersal as they roll. Many of the plants that are associated with these wallows are cultural plants, foods, tools, and medicines. So my own thesis research was looking at 130-year-old relic wallows and asking a question about whether they still serve a purpose in plant biodiversity. So my wife and I lived in our teepee for about 3 months, and we traveled around on my motorcycle, and we went to 150 of these relic wallows, and I yelled off plant names to her, and she marked it all down in this notebook that we still carry around and look at, because that was repeating the same plant names for hundreds of times. So we kind of make fun of some of those names still today. The wallows in tallgrass prairie, there's actually a lot of evidence to suggest that many foods, tools, and medicines grow around these wallows. But in the literature, there was very little about high elevation desert or shortgrass prairie. And so that became my thesis question, was do these relic wallows still serve a purpose in plant biodiversity? And was able to statistically show that there are several that still do. As a keystone species, they're very important to those four-leggeds, the prairie dog, black-footed ferret, badgers, but birds like the ferruginous hawk and the burrowing owl and mountain plover are actually 3 species that are listed as a concern by the Fish and Wildlife Service because of their declining numbers. Well, we noticed that where we restored buffalo, not only these 3 species, but many others come back. And many birds actually need buffalo hair for their eggs to reach the right incubation temperature. The cowbird is a misnomer. That should be the buffalo bird. But once a buffalo was gone, then this bird relied on cows, which is how it got its name. Many species are obviously also very important culturally. You've, the sage grouse, the dance of these birds is evidenced by many of our contemporary dancers, the chicken dancers. In the powwow circuit, we see the contemporary relationship to birds like this one. A buffalo has 7 times the hair per square inch as a cow. And every winter, they put on a new coat, and in the spring, they lose that. That hair goes down into the ground by mammals, which is important for soil chemistry. That hair goes up into the air with birds. A couple years ago, Patty was watching out there and saw an osprey flying over us, and it was carrying what looked like a snake, but it was actually a big piece of long buffalo hair, carrying it back to its nest. So that buffalo hair is very important, and it was not only important to these animals, but it was also important to us. That was a fiber that we used to make into rope. We would weave it into things for our horses, like our halters and bridles. We'd make it into rope that would be used on our teepees or lodges. So it had a lot of uses, and you that are in the room that are around buffalo, you know that in the springtime this hair just covers the ground, and you can go out and pick it up and gather it. But we also like to, give that hair to our little children when they come, to keep in their pocket. Reminds them of their connection to buffalo. There's a company down in Texas called the Buffalo Wool Company, and if we have winters like we did this year, I'd suggest getting some buffalo wool socks, because the buffalo wool socks are about the best fiber that you can have to keep your feet warm. These are those 3 species that I mentioned, arnica, tall bluebells, and yarrow. So when we measured our plant biodiversity around those relic wallows, our questions were, which cultural plants are in higher abundance still in this wallow as opposed to outside? So these are three cultural plants that were used for us and still benefited from the presence of those wallows, even though they were 130 years old. There's now a lot more support in terms of buffalo restoration. There's even the Bison Conservation Initiative, where there are 19 herds that the DOI manages. They're prioritizing these concepts that align and overlap with what we're talking about here. Wild herds, that they should be managed and respected as a wildlife species, kind of like that pronghorn antelope or that bighorn sheep, as opposed to being treated like livestock. That because of that small window of genetics, that small pie of 25,000 conservation animals, that we should be focused on the conservation of the genetics. That there's got to be shared stewardship between not only the states and the federal government, but the tribes. The tribes have a great deal at stake in terms of how these animals get used and where they go, how we're integrating them back into our communities. And again, the ecological importance of this keystone species. We've got a species that benefits birds and plants and is important in carbon storage and climate resiliency. That should be reason enough to be putting these animals back on the landscape. But that's a tough task. And of course, the cultural importance to our tribes, as well as the nutritional importance. There's now the International Buffalo Treaty, started in Canada. There's over 30 signatories of sovereigns tied to this document, but really recognizing, revitalizing this relationship. There's several hundred entities that have signed on as universities or municipalities, individuals. A lot of support behind this International Buffalo Treaty. And I know it's not that funny, but when we get together, we joke around about it being the only treaty that's never broken. This story we have about our connection to buffalo, it's in our songs, it's in our stories, it's in our creation stories, it's in our ceremonies. And so this connection, we just want to ensure that our young people are very knowledgeable about that. Ensuring that they know how different parts of the animals were used, how we would cook a meal with no pots or pans prior to all this stuff that we have around us when our people live very simply, very close to Mother Earth. Now, how would you cook a meal for 20 or 30 people without, a nice cook stove with a nice big pot? That buffalo stomach was how we did that. It made it possible for us to cook meals for our families, our communities, our tribe, our clan. And so the kids really love to talk about how these buffalo was used, from the hoof to the horn, to the sinew, to the hair, to the hide. The hide itself, a nice winter hide, was one of the most sought after items that you could have. With tough winters like we have here in Montana and like we've had this year in Wyoming, if you were still living very simply, that buffalo robe would keep you warm and alive, despite as cold as it gets. That buffalo hair really is very incredible in holding warmth. We started with our first 10 buffalo in 2016. We didn't have any buffalo for 131 years prior to that. And despite that, we've been able to hold on to our ceremonies like our Sundance, which the buffalo is integral to. You can't have a Sundance without that buffalo. And there was a period of time there where our tribes had to go and buy a buffalo, or they had to go and negotiate with some private rancher to get a buffalo. And this year, we were able to harvest our first buffalo for our Sundance. Even though we've had buffalo there for a few years, we wanted to grow up the population to a bit, but it's very significant that this is the first year that we've actually been able to use our own animals for that ceremony. That's very, very significant. Arapaho tribe harvested their first 2 last year. Ensuring that we create opportunities for our young ones to come into economic development. There's going to be a lot of opportunity for handling and management and training, research around buffalo. Our unemployment on our reservation is about 65%, similar to many other reservations where there isn't a lot of economic prosperity or jobs. With buffalo, we can create new jobs, but that's jobs that are very important to our people. And so every chance we get, we're always talking to our little ones. Not only our native kids, but also non-native, because it's also important for them to understand. We've got a lot of partners, non-governmental organizations. Johnny, I see you in there. And partners that are working kind of similarly in conservation, recognition of this buffalo and how important it is. There's a lot of stories in media about this buffalo coming home. And there's, again, this is just for Wind River, but this story, continues to be told as we restore more buffalo to our tribal communities. I was talking to Troy Heinert the other day. He's our executive director for Intertribal Buffalo Council, and he was just hauling some animals up to Grand Portage in northern Minnesota 2 days ago. They're getting their very first animals. Last November, I was in Menominee, Wisconsin. That tribe there received their first animals, and they had a great big ceremony. Last buffalo taken in Menominee was 1812. So also very important for them to reconnect with that buffalo, and they're working to get it back into their school lunch program, and they've got all kinds of kids coming out and media because this story is very important to those tribes and where they are. A few years ago, we had one of our tribes in Alaska, the Alutiiq. They needed some bulls from Yellowstone, and they through Intertribal Buffalo Council, we facilitated getting them a few Yellowstone bulls that went through the quarantine process over at Fort Peck. We called this Operation Buffalo Wings because in order to get buffalo to Alaska, we had to FedEx them. And so we put these buffalo on a truck at Fort Peck, and these 3 bulls went over to Blackfeet. There were some special containers built, and then they were put on another truck and driven to Seattle, where they got on a FedEx train. A FedEx plane, and then I almost said planes, trains, and automobiles. So they were FedEx to Anchorage, and then they got on another truck and were brought down to Homer, Alaska, and they got on a barge, and then they were brought by barge by 6 hours to Sitkalitik Island for the Alutiiq. So if you've been to Alaska, the prices of meat and protein is very astronomical. They are hunter-gatherer people, and they still subsist off of the ocean and hunt, but they were lacking protein. And they had some buffalo, but their genetic diversity was low. So getting some new genetics was very important to them. And so we, through the Intertribal Buffalo Council, paid $50,000 to FedEx these 3 animals up to Alaska, and now they're living very, very closely with grizzly bears, right on the same island. So it doesn't matter, where we look across the country, this similar story is being highlighted about how important it is for those people. Our program at Wind River is about healing, but it's also about the potential for changing some priority on land use. So you can see those lands that we lost in the Riverton Reclamation Project. You can see the proximity of that wilderness area. Remember how important that is already for wildlife and migration and corridors, habitat for wolves and bears. Our buffalo programs are kind of sitting in the middle here, and that isn't the entirety of it, but it's something that we're building to. In the 80s, the Shoshone tribe bought some land back. So keep that in mind, that this is the middle of a reservation, but the tribe is buying land back. Now, why is that? The Shoshone tribe back in the 80s purchased a property right here. This is a 300-acre property, but the tribe bought it back, and it was actually going to be the site of a casino in the 90s, but fortunately that didn't happen. So in 2014, we designated this for buffalo. We fenced it off in 2015, and then we brought our first 10 animals in 2016. First 10 animals came from the Neil Smith Wildlife Refuge in Iowa. Remember, all conservation animals. So 2017, 10 came from the National Bison Range here in Montana. 2019, we got 5 bulls from Fort Peck that were Yellowstone offspring. In 2021, we brought 26 from the Nature Conservancy out of Missouri. And in last November, we brought 4 from Antelope Island in Utah. A family actually purchased those and donated them to the tribe. And then recently, we received 10 from the city of Denver. The city of Denver has 2 conservation populations at Daniels Park and Genesee Park. So we now have about 80 animals and expecting about 30 calves. But this 300 acres wouldn't have been sufficient to hold all of our population. And so much of the effort is to reacquire land, buy land back. So we set up a nonprofit called the Wind River Tribal Buffalo Initiative, a local entity, tribally led, that can work to hold title to land, but also help facilitate the cultural, educational, academic, nutritional reconnection of Shoshone and Arapaho people to buffalo. So far, we've been able to raise $8.5 million to buy some of these lands back around. And so this is the current location for the Shoshone tribe's buffalo. It's taken a lot of, even though these lands were acquired for pennies per acre back in the 1890s, they're now worth 55 to 7,000 per acre. And so getting these lands for buffalo habitat or reacquiring land for buffalo habitat is rematriation. Rematriating those lands to buffalo, rematriating those tribes back to tribal land to add land back to the reservation. And this is a kind of a form of reconciliation that the people can actually help us buy land back for buffalo habitat that can be restored. This is the fence that we're getting ready to build. This will add another 900 acres on to what we currently have. So if you're ever going by Wind River Reservation on Highway 26, feel free to stop in and say hi to the buffalo there. Just south of the river, this is the Wind River. So just south of the Wind River is where the Arapaho buffalo are. They're on about 1,000 acres. And so the 2 tribes, we have 2 herds. And so we're continuing to not only reacquire land by raising the dollars to buy those lands back, but also work on land use change. Land use change is as it pertains to tribal land. And fortunately, our reservation isn't as checkerboarded as a lot. It is in parts of that Riverton Reclamation Project, but there's a range unit. And the reservation at Wind River was divided into 92 range units that are managed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs that for the last 130 years have also prioritized cattle on our tribal lands. So we have cattle producers on our lands, but this particular range unit doesn't have any cattle on it, and there's no permittee. And so it made it an ideal location to work with the 2 tribes, but also Bureau of Indian Affairs to designate this range unit for buffalo habitat. And so we're currently in that process right now so that we would essentially be able to open up the gates from either herd and restore a population out to the 17,000 acres so buffalo can essentially be protected as wildlife under that game code so that they can exist on a larger landscape. As we think a little bit further about expansion, there's other range units that are adjacent. And so this is actually a 70,000 acre parcel of land that's contained by 2 highways, Highway 287 on the west and 132 on the east, an area that's 70,000 acres. It's also visible to our tribal community. So Fort Washakie and Ethity are where primarily our tribal people live. If we restored buffalo to this area, we could essentially see buffalo out our back windows on this larger landscape. These range units do have cattle producers and tribal cattle producers, and so we're working closely with them as well. Our buffalo effort is in no way to diminish or undermine anyone's livelihood. These buffalo are important for all of our people, and there's plenty of range units for cattle to exist, but we also have the habitat for buffalo. And so finding that common ground and working with one another, building relationships, and ensuring that there isn't any animosity for these buffalo is a very important step. We have programs within National Wildlife Federation where we raise dollars to provide financial incentive. So as we work and build relationship with our tribal cattle producers here, we'll raise the financial capital to ensure that they're happy with that decision. Help them find a new range unit for their cattle. I know several of our cattle producers are elderly, and this financial incentive gives them the capability of transitioning away from cattle, or if they want to do something different, then that gives them a little opportunity to do that. Now, the habitat at Wind River is such that we already have large swaths of land that's available for our wildlife, like pronghorn antelope, bighorn sheep. When I was a little kid, the pronghorn antelope were released right here. And so the importance of that wilderness area has implications in this buffalo as well. Because if we are able to create a corridor for buffalo to move from 5,000 feet to 13,000 feet in elevation, this is one of the few places in the lower United States where that would be even possible. But it is possible. Not only is there 400,000 acres of habitat in the Wind River Mountains, the Wind Rivers, and remember those off-reservation federal lands, there's also 800,000 acres of habitat in the Owl Creeks. So we have 92 grazing units that the Bureau of Indian Affairs manages with a priority in cattle, despite the tribe's success in conservation and a reintroduction of pronghorn antelope and bighorn sheep. Bureau of Indian Affairs was not involved when we restored those species. But Bureau of Indian Affairs needs to be involved in terms of bison restoration. Because if the BIA is managing our lands, then we have to ensure that our cattle producers are looked after. The goal is never to replace all cattle on the reservation. And there's misconceptions and there's rumors and things that fly about that. But the goal is to prioritize areas where buffalo can be restored, like this 70,000 acre chunk of land that's right in the middle of the reservation, or some of these other range units that would allow them to exist in the Wind Rivers. We have a chunk of property that we also purchased up here that has some potential, and so I'm working with the tribal cattle producers that are in these range units as well. And so the hope is that we can look at 8 to 10 of these range units that we can prioritize for buffalo, and that doesn't diminish any of the lands that we still have available for our cattle producers. The tribes have implemented an ag resource management plan, and many tribes have done this. I know Fort Peck worked with an organization that is working with us on this ag plan. This is essentially our process for prioritizing buffalo, because there's 3 objectives in there that talk about habitat areas and corridors and priority areas and protecting and enhancing management of lands. And so this is basically more tribal law that allows us the capability of reprioritizing some of these range units. With Deb Haaland as Secretary of Interior, she understands the importance of buffalo to our people. There's Secretarial Order 3403. It talks about consolidation within reservations, including private inholdings for conservation, protection, cultural, exercise of subsistence, or treaty reserve rights. So that's exactly what's happening with the acquisition of those fee lands on the reservation and creating them for buffalo habitat. So this is a secretarial order from the Secretary of Interior that supports exactly what's happening at Wind River and other places. So as we consider and think about expansion of habitat, how do we do that in a way that works? protecting buffalo as wildlife, working closely with BIA and our tribal cattle producers to ensure, because we know that buffalo and cattle, there's room for both. And I mentioned that area that was just purchased up there in the Owl Creeks. This is a 640-acre property that's going to be very important for our youth. We want to do youth camps up at that area. We're going to do a stream restoration project, beaver mimicry, maybe even putting beaver back. This area was heavily grazed by cattle, and so we want to do a stream restoration project on that, working closely with our youth. This is a place where we can get them away from cell service, so they can put their devices away and put the video games down for a little bit and get connected. There's a lot of pictographs and petroglyphs there, actually with buffalo in them. This chunk of land was part of those lands that were ceded to homesteading. The 640 acres was in non-tribal hands since 1902. And even though it's surrounded by tribal land, you drive through there and there's all kinds of no trespassing signs, private property signs. So again, as our reservations were opened up for homesteading, we became trespassers on our own lands. By acquiring them back, we're no longer trespassers. Many of those off-reservation federal lands like Shoshone National Forest, Bridger-Teton Wilderness National Park, again, those were all part of our original treaty territory in 1863. And so as we think more about how the federal government honors those treaties, those obligations, it also means access to our traditional lands. We like to go over to Shoshone National Forest and get teepee poles. We like to go in some of those areas and gather some of those medicines that we use in our ceremonies. We even have conducted our sun dances in some of these off-reservation federal lands. So very important in terms of how that self-determination and sovereignty is exercised today. There's a lot of talk about that these days, about how tribes are exercising their rights in places that are off-reservation. And that creates some contention and misunderstanding. Wind River, our proximity to Yellowstone is advantageous. Because of that Yellowstone population, those animals are highly sought after. There's a lot of issues with Yellowstone, like the treaty hunt and the hunt at Beatty Gulch and tribes exercising their rights there. How conservation plays into that. We're likely going to see an increase in the number of live animals that we can get out of the park, certified as disease-free, that can go to tribes or supplement existing populations, because, again, those genetics are so important. So there's a lot of implications there for the tribes at Wind River and in our say as to what happens to Yellowstone animals. Again, some of those off-reservation federal lands. Our Wyoming flag has the ghost of a buffalo, and it also shows the Great Seal. The Great Seal has some words in there that make me think about colonization, and it says livestock, mines, grain, and oil. Okay, that is the Great Seal of Wyoming, which is really just a demonstration of exploitation. How do we exploit these resources on the ghost of a buffalo? So it makes me think a little bit about what they have written in stone. This is right in the front of the Capitol in Cheyenne, Wyoming, about really what the ideas of the state are. Now that's, to me, exploitation. Livestock, mines, grain, and oil. Native people have a little bit different philosophy in that medicine wheel. That cyclical understanding, our connection to our foods, that water, the fish, the birds. It's not about exploitation. It's a more holistic relationship, a reciprocity that we have with these critters, our relatives that we live here with. So as that buffalo was restored, it brought back a new sense of hope for our young people, even our old people. because this is like bringing home our long-lost relative. And, in the last 7 years, we've had thousands of people come to visit, to have that connection, to learn a little bit about the history, about the importance of buffalo to our people, the Shoshone and the Arapaho, its importance on the landscape. This was the very first calf born in 2017. Since then, we've had over 20 calves, over 30 calves born, and expecting about 30 more calves here in the next few weeks. So to see that regeneration, that new life coming back, is very important. We also harvest these animals as they get older, the bulls, and ensure that we have our young people there to learn how we are utilizing this animal from the hoof up, and making sure that our people are getting that back into their diet. This meat will be made available free to our tribal members. We don't charge our tribal members to get this meat back in their diet, because it's important for us all to heal together, to learn about that education that the buffalo provided for us, and reintegrating that. It's not a relic of the past anymore, but is a vital part of our future. It wasn't very long ago that we couldn't say these things. When my dad was a biologist, this was the reason he was reprimanded by the Secretary of Interior, because he was talking about land back, water back, culture back, bringing indigenous knowledge to the forefront of science. So we can now say these things, and we are teaching our children to be proud of who they are as Shoshones, Arapahos, Crows, Lakotas, Blackfeet, to ensure that they can carry forward our belief systems of their grandmas and grandpas, their values and beliefs, their songs, their language, their ceremony, because something special happens again when these kids get to see a buffalo and make a connection, make a relationship. So we see this happen over and over and over, where our young people find something within themselves that they didn't even know was missing, their connection to their relative. I was talking to a group of 7th graders, and this one young boy, he said, "Hey, do you think we'll ever be able to hunt buffalo on horseback?" And I thought back to this picture. This was considered the last buffalo hunt in Yellowstone. And there were Cheyennes and Arapahos, Lakotas that were riding in this. And it was for a film. It's in one of them crazy old black and white movies that doesn't have a very good storyline. But I told that young man, I really think we can. Someday we'll be able to hunt buffalo on horseback, because we can create that. The Arapaho buffalo got out a few years ago. There was a gap in the fence, and several of them went running in that larger expansion area I showed you. And they come up against the fence, and then everybody was all up in arms about the buffalo being out. But it was the first time that we had to deal with something like that. And everybody was all excited about it. Community came together, and the first day it was a mess. Everybody was out there running around, driving their vehicles all over the sagebrush. Buffalo running all over the place. It was not working very good. We settled down and decided, we'll regroup the next day. And Patty got her brother and nephew, and we had 3 guys on horses. And we had a prayer, and we smudged and talked to one another about, we just need to settle down and just take it slow. And so we got on horses, and we walked these buffalo about 7 miles back to the enclosure. But that was the first time that we've seen little Indian boys on their horses chasing buffalo around, trying to get them animals back in. And so I thought about this picture when that seventh grader said, I think we could probably hunt buffalo on horseback again someday if that's what we want to do. A lot of the idea of bringing things back, and bringing some science into this is about our understanding of biodiversity, the abundance of species. We see on a worldwide level that biodiversity across the planet is decreasing, from amphibians to birds, to species of plants. Biodiversity is decreasing on a worldwide, but 80% of the world's biodiversity exists on lands managed by indigenous people. And that's not a coincidence. And so we have to begin thinking about what we want to leave for our future. And for us, by bringing buffalo back, it's bringing back the biodiversity of those plants that we use for foods and tools and medicines, but it's also about healing that land and healing ourselves. So I mentioned those buffalo in Europe. Here's an article about wild bison returning for the UK for the first time in thousands of years. Europe is reintroducing bison because of their understanding of the ecological importance of this keystone species. They don't have a cultural connection to buffalo, and that's reason enough to restore them. Europeans. So this was the first calf born in Europe from those folks working to rewild their programs. I fly back to DC quite a bit, and I look out the window, oftentimes flying east, and you can see how bad this country's been plowed up, paved over, fenced in, fenced out, fractionated. This is light pollution in the United States. And as I think about that biodiversity, or I think about larger landscapes and think about what we've done in this country, my hope is that our kids won't have to see the entire country look like the Eastern Path. That we will have some places in the West where we didn't mess it up. That we did do the right thing for habitat and for these animals, plants that we live here with. And, I hope that that in our lifetime it doesn't get much worse than that. But that's the idea of progress. That's grounded in manifest destiny. That is the age-old ideology that allowed for all of this to happen in the first place. Those broken promises, broken treaties. Treaties weren't broken, I guarantee it wouldn't look like this. So, as tribes, there's a newfound era. We're trying to do some different things. And we're trying to help our young people, trying to help our communities. And a lot of that is around getting some land back. It's raising dollars to buy land. What's happening at American Prairie and restoring the ecological integrity and restoring the keystone species, it's all very similar to what we're trying to do at Wind River and create a place that we can actually leave better than the way we found it. The Wind River Tribal Buffalo Initiative was started so that we can continue working with both the tribes at Wind River to acquire more land, to continue building that buffalo into our curriculum for young people. Work closely with academia, Montana State, Colorado State, University of Wyoming, on opportunities that provide culturally relevant research to our tribal students so that when they come home there's ways to work around buffalo. So as a species that is important to the land, that has implications in carbon storage or climate resiliency. And with a changing environment, changing climate, we want to ensure that we're able to feed our people in the future. So should something go wrong, we're living in a crazy world today. Who knows what China and Russia might do, but at least we might have some buffalo to eat for a while if something does go wrong. But our young people are the future. And when I was talking to some high schoolers here earlier today, when I was their age, I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know which direction I was going to go. But that trip to East Africa changed my life. It gave me a newfound appreciation for who I am and where I come from. And buffalo was the avenue to get to something much better. And so I'm very fortunate to now have a career in working on buffalo restoration and helping tribes, not only my own and my own home community, but tribes across the country that are working to restore that connection to our food, that connection to the animal. And so I want to thank the Discovery Center for the invitation to be here with you this evening, and of course for all of your interest in this. And I know that we're in an area where buffalo restoration is a kind of a contentious issue. It's the same everywhere we go. It's a paradigm shift. And so the more that we can work together, communicate, and partner and collaborate on issues like this, then I think the better off we'll be. So I'm just very, very honored for the invitation to come and visit with you about buffalo and what it means for us down there at Wind River. But there's obviously tribes here in Montana that have that very similar understanding and appreciation for this animal and are working very diligently to do very similar work. So kudos to all of those folks in the room that are in buffalo restoration in your own home communities doing that work, and of course for the continued support. You know, I looked at that big buffalo plaque when we walked in to this building, and you can see all of the names of people who've donated to help make this possible here, this Discovery Center, as well as American Prairie, and you know, the incredible work that's happening up here, Scott Heidebrink and others. The work here is very, very tremendous, and a lot of the conversations I have across the U.S., APR, American Prairie, gets brought up a lot. And so as a fellow tribal member doing similar work at my own home community, you know, there's a lot that we can learn from and draw from experience to ensure that we're doing good things, ensuring that, you know, we're looking out for the greater good. And so I just want to say thank you again. We say hui hu in our language. Thank you for the opportunity to visit with you this evening, and hopefully I didn't put anybody to sleep. I didn't see any nodding heads too bad, but thanks for all coming. Appreciate it. Questions? Happy to take any questions if there is some. There's one right there. Oh.
How do buffaloes modulate their internal temperature? They obviously exist within a wide variety of biomes, hot and cold. How do they manage that? Do you know?
That is a great technical question that I would defer to someone else who's a lot smarter than me to answer that one. I just know that they do that, and that's reason enough for me to know that they're important. I would have to defer to somebody who could explain that a little better than I can.
And then one more, just to defer to the map you were showing. So you were showing plenty of land that you're planning to add. How are you dealing with that with water rights? Do the buffalo have enough water to survive within that environment?
Yeah, the buffalo on those properties, we're right next to the Wind River. They've got actually 4 sources of water that they draw from. We've drilled a couple wells, but they also have access to the river itself. So the water isn't an issue on these particular lands, because when we buy those fee lands back, the water right comes with it. Where we would have an issue perhaps with water would be on those tribal lands that are the range units. And so as we piece together more land, you know, water is obviously a very critical component to ensure that they have access to it. So we think very carefully about that. Thanks.
A lot of times when we deal with natural resource issues, it gets to be an either-or type situation. And you mentioned a couple times in your presentation how contentious this issue can be. And I think that's kind of an understatement. But I wonder, do you see opportunities where we can start to bridge that either-or gap? And I think about those livestock allotments that you have right now. And I confess I'm not that conversant on buffalo biology, but is there a way to have both cattle and buffalo grazing on the same allotments and not have to worry about interbreeding and things like that, to where it doesn't become one or the other, at least not right away. You know, it's a chance to sort of transition from one to the other.
So there was this type of a question around the Henry Mountains and Book Cliffs buffalo herds in Utah, where they were restored in the 60s by the state of Utah and are actually one of the only publicly managed herds in the nation. They wondered whether buffalo and cattle had interbred, and you know, even though there's buffalo and cattle using the landscape together, there's been zero inbreeding between cattle and buffalo. They do not breed. That is a situation that was very, you know, they did that on purpose. You know, you put buffalo and cows in a similar area, they're going to avoid each other. They don't really like one another. So there's not an issue with inbreeding. The issue that comes up is disease, but not diseases coming from buffalo to cattle, because we know that we can mitigate that, and then specifically with brucellosis. What is a very major concern for buffalo is diseases from livestock. And most livestock producers are not required to vaccinate against things like Mycoplasma bovis or malignant catarrhal fever. Mycoplasma bovis, if it gets in our buffalo herd, will kill 25% of the population. Malignant catarrhal fever is an airborne disease that can float up to 5 miles and comes from domestic sheep. So we have had animals die from malignant catarrhal fever. Fortunately, Mycoplasma bovis isn't present in Wyoming, but it is present in many other herds, and that's actually a sub-Saharan African disease that came with exotic wildlife to Texas. So that pathogen, that disease, has moved north and is more prevalent in hot, humid environments. But because of its prevalence, we now have to sterilize our trailers, and we do not move buffalo in trailers that have hauled cattle, because there isn't a way to vaccinate for it. So there isn't an issue with buffalo interbreeding with cows, but cattle and other domestic livestock carry diseases that are fatal to buffalo. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Did you know your father was a fisheries biologist here in Lewistown?
I did know that. He lived on Water Street.